Imagine holding a piece of paper that says a new protocol, like a new medication or a workflow, will absolutely save your patient's life.
Right. It's printed in this really prestigious medical journal.
Exactly. It's been peer-reviewed by experts, the abstract has all the perfect buzzwords, and the graphs look totally professional. It is just staring you right in the face.
But, and here is the terrifying part, that piece of paper could be completely dangerously wrong.
Yeah. Today, we're going to learn how to spot the lie. Welcome back to the deep dive, everyone.
We're speaking directly to you today, you, the person sitting there right now, with a massive stack of articles you've just pulled from your database search.
You know, you've done the really hard work of building that search strategy. You've crossed the finish line of finding the literature, but finding a study is not the same as having an answer.
It's just such a common you see this constantly in clinical meetings, right?
Yeah.
Someone reads a single abstract over their morning coffee,
Oh, I've seen it 100 times.
and they walk into a huddle and just declare, you know, the evidence says we need to change our entire unit policy today.
They treat that abstract as if it's this objective, flawless blueprint.
But the abstract is really just a movie trailer. I mean, the authors constructed it to highlight the most dramatic, statistically significant findings, mostly just to convince a journal editor to publish it.
Right, the trailer doesn't show you the plot holes.
Exactly. It doesn't show you the corners they cut. You cannot know if the study actually supports its own conclusions until you crack it open and stress test the methodology.
Okay, let's unpack this because that is the exact framework we're using today. Our mission is to give you the flashlight, the mechanic's creeper, to get under the hood of those articles.
We're going to look at the 4 core questions of evidence appraisal.
But before we get there, I really want to tackle the word appraisal itself. A lot of people hear that and instantly feel like they're being asked to act as, like, an attack dog.
Yeah, like the goal is to rip a researcher's life's work to shreds, just to prove how smart we are.
Right, which is a complete misunderstanding of the scientific process. Appraisal is not demolition, it is truth-seeking.
When we appraise, we are basically acting as structural engineers.
Mm.
I mean, if you are about to drive a heavy truck over a bridge, you don't inspect the concrete because you hate the architect.
You inspect it because you need to know exactly how much weight that bridge can bear before it collapses.
Precisely. Evidence is the same. We are simply determining the load-bearing capacity of the study so we know if it can support the weight of a real clinical decision.
Okay, I love that analogy. So before we can even ask if the bridge is well built, we have to look at what kind of bridge we are actually dealing with.
We have to categorize the evidence in that stack.
Because, you can't judge a study's quality until you know what the study was fundamentally designed to do in the first place.
The tools dictate the outcome. Let's say you have a clinical question about causation, like, does intervention A cause outcome B?
You'd need a specific type of research design for that?
Right. If someone hands you a wrench and you need to drive a nail into a piece of wood, you're going to destroy the wood, you're going to bend the nail, and end up incredibly frustrated.
The wrench failed, but it wasn't a broken wrench.
Exactly. You just used it for the wrong job.
Which brings up something I wonder about. Is this why I see people entirely dismiss qualitative research sometimes? Because they're treating it like a broken hammer.
That is a brilliant way to phrase it, yes. But let's talk about the heavy machinery first, because that is what usually fills up these literature searches.
Experimental research?
Yes. And the undisputed heavyweight champion here is the randomized controlled trial, or RCT.
So what makes the RCT the ultimate tool for proving causation?
The entire magic of the RCT rests on one single mathematical concept, and that is random assignment.
Okay.
When you have an intervention group and a control group, the only way you can confidently say the intervention caused the outcome is if those two groups were practically identical on day one.
Wait, let me stop you right there. I hear identical, and I just think about standard matching.
How so?
Like, if I have 50 patients, and I make sure both groups have the exact same number of men and women, the same average age, the same baseline blood pressure, haven't I made them identical? Why do I need a computer to randomly sort them?
Because you are only matching the variables you know about. Human biology is this massive black box of millions of hidden variables.
Oh, right.
What if one group happens to have more patients with an undetected genetic mutation that affects drug metabolism?
Or what if they have, like, higher baseline cortisol levels because of undiagnosed stress at home?
Exactly. You cannot manually match for things you cannot see. Randomization is the mathematical equalizer.
So it just scrambles everything up?
Yes. By randomly assigning a large enough group of people, The laws of probability ensure that all those hidden, invisible variables are distributed pretty evenly across both groups.
Oh, wow, that makes complete sense. So random assignment is almost like a shield against the unknown variables.
That's a great way to look at it.
It balances out the invisible stuff, so the only major difference between the two groups is the new drug or the new protocol you're giving them.
Precisely. That isolation of the intervention is the only way you could ever use the word cause in science.
But, the reality of healthcare is that we don't always work in a pristine laboratory environment.
We certainly do not.
So we step down a level to quasi-experimental designs. These still test an intervention, but they completely drop the random assignment. Why would researchers deliberately choose a weaker design?
Well, they don't really choose it. Reality just forces it upon them. Imagine trying to run a study on a new nurse-to-patient staffing ratio.
Okay.
You ethically and logistically cannot take 50 nurses on a single intensive care unit and randomly assign half of them to a 1-to-1 ratio and the other half to a 1-to-3 ratio.
Oh, yeah, that would cause absolute chaos on the floor.
Right. So you have to find workarounds. You implement the new ratio on Unit A, and you use Unit B as your control group.
Which, that sounds perfectly reasonable on paper. Unit A gets the intervention, Unit B keeps the old standard.
But look at the variables. Because you didn't randomize, you have no shield.
Right, those hidden variables we just talked about.
Exactly. What if Unit A has this incredibly charismatic, supportive charge nurse, and Unit B has a really toxic culture?
Or what if Unit A gets mostly cardiovascular patients and Unit B gets mostly neurotrauma?
Yes. If Unit A shows a massive reduction in patient mortality after 6 months, can you definitively say it was the staffing ratio? Or was it the charismatic charge nurse?
You can't untangle them.
You really can't. Quasi-experimental designs are vital for real-world research, but their conclusions are inherently vulnerable.
Okay, let's move out of the realm of testing interventions entirely. Let's look at non-experimental or descriptive research.
This includes your cross-sectional surveys, cohort studies, case control studies.
Here, the researchers aren't doing anything to the patients. They aren't implementing a new ratio or giving a drug. They are just watching.
They are essentially epidemiologists in the wild. They're looking at what naturally occurs and trying to map the relationships.
Let me throw a scenario at you, something very common in the nursing literature. You pull a descriptive survey from your stack of articles.
Hook.
It surveyed thousands of nurses across the country. And the data clearly shows that nurses who work 12-hour shifts report a significantly higher number of medication errors than nurses who work 8-hour shifts.
A classic finding.
It's statistically significant. The p-value is tiny.
It is a critical piece of data. But the trap is how you interpret it. You will inevitably have someone look at that survey and announce, 12-hour shifts cause medication errors. We must eliminate them immediately.
Which is jumping from association to causation. Right. They're just assuming the long hours are making the nurses tired, which leads to the error.
They're completely ignoring the hidden ecosystem of the hospital. Let's think about the context. What kind of units typically mandate 12-hour shifts?
Often it's emergency departments, intensive care units, or units that are chronically understaffed and trying to stretch their workforce.
Right. And what happens on those specific units? The patient acuity is much higher. The medications administered are highly complex, continuous infusions rather than, a simple daily pill.
So the higher error rate might have absolutely nothing to do with the 12th hour of the shift.
Exactly.
It might just be that 12-hour shifts are clustered in environments where errors are naturally more likely to happen anyway.
Yes. The survey cannot disentangle those factors. It can only tell you that 12-hour shifts and medication errors share the same space. It is an association.
It's a starting point for deeper investigation, not a final answer.
What's fascinating here is how this transitions into another type of research.
Yeah.
We have all these quantitative tools, RCTs, quasi-experiments, surveys that deal in numbers, statistics, and graphs.
And then we have qualitative research. I have seen highly quantitative clinicians look at a qualitative study, see that it involves interviewing 12 people about their feelings, and just dismiss it completely as unscientific fluff.
Like they're treating a perfectly good wrench like a broken hammer.
Exactly. Are they just totally missing the point?
They are. We have this deep cultural obsession with numbers. We're conditioned to believe that if you cannot calculate a standard deviation, it just isn't rigorous.
Right.
But consider a scenario where your hospital rolls out a brand new evidence-based diabetic diet protocol. It works perfectly in the lab.
Okay.
But a month later, patient compliance is at 10%. Patients are flat out refusing the meals.
So you run an RCT to fix it.
How could you? What are you testing? Are you
Yeah.
going to randomize patients to be force-fed?
Yeah, an RCT is entirely useless there.
You don't have a numbers problem, you have a human behavior problem. You need a qualitative researcher to sit down with those patients, conduct unstructured, deeply empathetic interviews, and discover the why.
Like maybe the new diet violates a cultural dietary norm in your community.
Or maybe the food simply arrives cold every day.
And you can't put a p-value on cold food.
No, you absolutely cannot. Qualitative research mines for meaning, context, and lived experience. The data consists of words and themes, not stats.
It is a completely different paradigm of science.
It is. And when your clinical question begins with why or how does it feel to, qualitative research is the exact wrench you need. It is never less than. It is just answering a different question.
All right, so we've sorted our stack. We know if we are holding a causation tool, an association tool, or a meaning tool.
But sometimes you pull an article that isn't single study at all.
Right. We need to look at the syntheses, systematic reviews, and meta-analyses. If a single study is a single piece of fruit, these are the smoothies.
And the distinction between the two is vital. A systematic review is a highly structured, exhaustively documented process of finding literally every single piece of published and sometimes unpublished literature on a specific clinical question.
So they don't just search Google Scholar.
No, they scour global databases, they grade every single study for quality, and they synthesize the narrative of what the total body of evidence is saying.
And then the meta-analysis takes it one step further into the math.
Yes, a meta-analysis extracts the raw numerical data from all those individual RCTs and mathematically pools it.
So if you have 10 separate studies, each with 100 patients,
The meta-analysis basically treats it as one massive trial of 1,000 patients. It gives you incredible statistical power to see tiny, subtle effects that a single study might miss.
let me stop you there, though, because I have a serious concern about this smoothie concept. It sounds incredibly authoritative.
It does.
But what if the blender is full of rotten fruit? Like, what if the researchers combined 10 studies, but all 10 of those studies had terrible methodologies?
At the huge risk.
Maybe they all had huge dropout rates or using unreliable measurement tools.
Well, if that happens, then you have just manufactured a highly dangerous lie. A meta-analysis of poorly conducted, highly biased trials will produce a result that is mathematically precise, incredibly confident, and entirely false.
Wow, so it actually amplifies the errors.
It does. This is exactly why you must appraise a meta-analysis just as ruthlessly as a single trial. You have to check the methods section to see exactly what their inclusion criteria were.
Did they let low-quality studies into the blender?
Exactly. Because if so, the smoothie is toxic.
That makes me look at those massive review papers very differently. But what about clinical practice guidelines?
Guidelines.
We rely on these constantly. The American Heart Association, the World Health Organization, the local critical care consortium, they publish these beautiful PDF documents telling us exactly what the standard of care should be.
Guidelines are fascinating because they're essentially expert panels doing the synthesis for you and then translating that synthesis into direct clinical instructions.
Right.
But they are deeply vulnerable to human nature. When you appraise a guideline, the most important section is not the recommendation itself. It is the disclosure of the development panel.
You're talking about conflicts of interest.
Absolutely. If a major medical society publishes a guideline stating that a specific, highly expensive new continuous glucose monitor is now the gold standard of care.
You need to look at the panel of doctors who wrote that guideline.
Yes. Because if 6 out of the 10 doctors on the panel receive annual speaking fees, research grants, or consulting retainers from the manufacturer of that exact monitor,
The objectivity of that guideline is severely compromised.
even if they claim they were completely objective, that financial entanglement creates a massive shadow over the recommendation.
That's a great point.
Furthermore, you have to look at the date. A guideline is only as good as the evidence it reviewed.
Right. If you are reading a guideline published in 2017, it does not include any of the explosive medical research that happened during or after 2020.
In fast-moving fields, a 5-year-old guideline might be functionally obsolete.
Which brings us to a really crucial point. Not all evidence is published in a journal.
No, it isn't.
The framework we are using explicitly values non-research evidence. We are talking about clinical expertise, quality improvement data like QI data from your own hospital floors, patient preferences, case reports.
Right.
I feel like in academia, this stuff sometimes gets treated as anecdotal or weak.
It is only weak if you try to use it to prove global causation. but it is incredibly powerful for local application.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Think about the triad of evidence-based practice. It is the integration of the best external evidence, your clinical expertise, and patient values.
Right, those three pillars.
If you find a massive, beautifully executed RCT from a highly funded academic center in Sweden that proves a new alarm fatigue protocol works flawlessly, that is great external evidence. But it isn't enough.
Right, because my hospital isn't in Sweden. My nurses aren't those nurses.
Exactly. You need the internal quality improvement data from your own telemetry unit.
Like how many alarms are actually triggering on your floor per shift?
Yes. What is the current burnout rate of your specific staff? The Swedish RCT provides the theory. Your local QI data provides the reality.
You cannot make a safe clinical decision without marrying the two.
You really can't. Explicitly, the Johns Hopkins model includes this non-research evidence for that exact reason.
Okay, so the landscape is set. We know what we are holding. Now we actually have to grade the paper.
The fun part.
We start the formal appraisal process. The framework uses 4 core questions. Let's look at question 1 and question 2.
These act as a sort of threshold, a gateway.
If a study can't pass these 2 questions, you shouldn't even bother trying to apply it. Question 1 is simple. Was the design appropriate for the clinical question?
And it is shocking how often the answer is no. Researchers will ask a question that requires a hammer and then use a wrench.
Let me give you a very common example. You are reading a study published by a local hospital.
Good.
The abstract proudly declares, "We implemented a strict hourly rounding protocol on our medical surgical unit and patient falls decreased by 20% over the next 6 months."
And the conclusion says, hourly rounding reduces falls.
Exactly. A lot of people read that and say, "Incredible! Proof! We should do this immediately."
It sounds like proof until you actually think about the mechanics of hospital falls. They are not a static phenomenon. A fall rate is influenced by a massive web of variables.
What kind of variables?
Well, what season was it? Did the implementation happen in the spring, when perhaps the unit was admitting younger, more mobile patients compared to the frail, elderly patients they admit during winter flu and pneumonia surges?
Oh, that makes a huge difference.
Or did they simultaneously hire 3 new, highly experienced nurses during those 6 months?
Or maybe the hospital just had fewer total admissions that month, so the nurses naturally had more time to watch the patients.
Exactly. The researchers observed 2 things sequentially. They started rounding, and falls went down.
But because they used a simple pre- and post-observational design without a control group?
Right. They didn't have a unit that didn't do hourly rounding during that exact same 6-month period to compare against.
So they have absolutely no structural proof that the rounding caused the reduction.
None. The design is fundamentally incapable of answering their own question.
So if the design is wrong, you stop. But let's say they passed question 1, they asked a causation question, and they actually built a proper RCT.
Now we move to question 2. Was the study well executed?
Because a perfect blueprint doesn't matter if the builders pour concrete in the rain.
Execution is where you take out your magnifying glass. You are looking for the structural integrity of the methodology. This is where we dive into the concept of internal validity.
Internal validity, that is a heavy foundational term. Let's break it down.
Internal validity asks one hyper-specific question. Can you trust the results for the people who are inside this specific study?
Okay.
Did the intervention and absolutely nothing else cause the outcome that was observed in this specific group of patients?
So if a study has high internal validity, the researchers basically built an impenetrable fortress. They controlled all the outside variables so tightly that you know with absolute certainty what happened inside those walls.
Yes, but in reality, that fortress is constantly under siege, and the attackers have a collective name: bias.
Right, bias.
Bias is any systematic error in the design, conduct, or analysis of a study that distorts the results in one specific direction.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because we need to translate this vocabulary. The vocabulary of bias gets thrown around in meetings all the time, and usually incorrectly.
It really does.
Let's look at the menu of biases, starting with selection bias.
Selection bias happens at the very beginning of the timeline. It means the groups you were comparing were not truly comparable at the starting line.
Give me an example of that.
Let's say you are testing a new, very intense physical therapy regimen for joint replacement patients.
Okay.
If the clinicians subconsciously or even consciously, out of a desire to help steer the younger, more motivated patients into the new therapy group and leave the older, frailer patients in the standard care group,
Oh, wow. The results are rigged before anyone even does a single exercise.
Exactly. The younger group will obviously heal faster, and the new therapy will look like a miracle when in reality it was just tested on healthier people.
The fortress wall breached on day one.
Yes. Next is attrition bias. This is about who leaves the study and why.
People drop out of studies all the time, though. They move away, they get tired of filling out surveys. Why is that a bias?
Random dropouts aren't a bias, they're just a nuisance. It becomes attrition bias when the dropouts are fundamentally different from the people who stay.
Okay, that makes sense.
Let's use oncology as an example. Researchers are testing a new, highly aggressive chemotherapy agent. They start with 100 people in the intervention group.
Okay.
But the drug has horrific, debilitating side effects. Nausea, neuropathy, extreme fatigue. Over 6 months, 40 of those patients simply cannot take it anymore and drop out of the trial.
So the researchers are left with 60 patients.
And if those 60 patients happen to be the ones with the strongest immune systems or the specific genetic makeup that tolerates the drug better, and their tumors shrink.
Oh, man. If the researchers only published the data on the 60 people who finished, the drug looks incredibly effective and highly tolerable.
Yes.
They've essentially erased the failure by ignoring the people who suffered the most.
Precisely. The data is systematically distorted. Good researchers use a technique called intention-to-treat analysis to mathematically account for those dropouts. But if they don't, attrition bias ruins the study.
That is dark. Let's move to measurement or detection bias.
Yeah.
This is about how the data is actually collected.
Imagine you are the lead investigator. You spent 10 years developing a new surgical technique. You believe in it with your whole heart.
Okay.
Now, you are running the trial, and you are the one assessing the patient's post-operative mobility. When you evaluate a patient who received your new technique, you might subconsciously ask the questions a little more gently. You might unconsciously score them a little higher on the mobility scale because you want so desperately to see improvement.
It's not even malicious fraud. It's just human nature wanting to be right.
Which is why blinding is paramount. The person assessing the outcome should have absolutely no idea which group the patient was in. If the blinding is broken or never existed, measurement bias leaks in.
Which feels very similar to performance bias.
They are cousins, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Measurement bias is about how you assess the patient. Performance bias is about how you treat the patient during the trial.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Think about the nursing staff. If a nurse knows that a patient is in the control group and is only receiving a sugar pill for their pain, the nurse's innate desire to heal kicks in.
Oh, so the nurse might spend an extra 10 minutes in that room, dimming the lights, offering a warm blanket, repositioning the patient, just trying to offer some comfort because they know the pill won't help.
Exactly. And what happens? That extra attention, that therapeutic touch, actually reduces the patient's perception of pain.
So the control group's outcomes artificially improve.
Yes. The gap between the real drug and the placebo narrows, and the trial fails. Not because the drug didn't work, but because the nurses altered the environment. Performance bias is basically the Hawthorne effect in action.
And finally, reporting bias. This feels like a systemic issue in science.
It is the file drawer problem. Scientific journals love a breakthrough. They want to publish the paper that says, "We found the cure."
Right.
They have very little interest in publishing a paper that says, "We tested this molecule for 5 years and it did absolutely nothing." So researchers just shove those negative trials into a file drawer and never publish them.
Which distorts the entire universe of literature. If I do a search, I only see the positive results. I have absolutely no idea that 20 other teams tried the same thing and failed.
It is a massive threat to the integrity of evidence-based practice.
Okay, I want to clarify something that always trips me up. When I look at these biases, selection, measurement, attrition, it feels like the researchers or the clinicians messed up. They let their guard down. But then there's this other word, confounding. People use bias and confounding interchangeably all the time, but they aren't the same, are they?
They are completely different mechanisms. Bias is a flaw in the methodology. The researchers let the fortress walls crumble. Confounding is the universe playing a trick on the researchers.
A trick.
A confounder is a third, hidden variable that exists out in the real world, and it is secretly linked to both the exposure you are studying and the outcome you're tracking. It creates the illusion of a relationship where none exists.
The classic historical example of this is the coffee and lung cancer story. Can we dissect that? Because it perfectly illustrates how insidious confounding is.
It is the textbook example for a reason. Back in the mid-20th century, huge observational studies were tracking the lifestyle habits of thousands of adults over decades. They gathered massive amounts of data.
Right.
And when they ran the statistics, an alarming pattern emerged. People who drank heavy amounts of coffee, 3, 4, 5 cups a day, had a dramatically higher incidence of lung cancer than people who drank no coffee.
The statistics were real, though. The math wasn't wrong.
The math was completely accurate based on the data provided. You can imagine the panic. Coffee was suddenly a suspected carcinogen. But the researchers missed the invisible third variable.
Which was?
In that era, the lifestyle habit of heavy coffee drinking was deeply culturally intertwined with heavy cigarette smoking. You sat at the diner, you drank a pot of coffee, and you chain smoked.
So the people drinking the most coffee also happened to be the people smoking the most cigarettes.
Yes, smoking is the confounder. Smoking causes lung cancer. But because the smoking was riding alongside the coffee drinking, the coffee took the blame in the raw data.
It was guilt by association.
Exactly.
How do you even fix that? How do you separate them?
You have to mathematically stratify the data. Once the researchers realized the error, they separated the data into groups. Non-smokers who drank coffee and smokers who drank coffee.
And then what happened?
When they looked only at the non-smokers, the link between coffee and lung cancer completely vanished. The universe threw a confounder into the mix, and until the researchers mathematically controlled for it, the truth was hidden.
That is fascinating. Okay, the last piece of the execution puzzle is reliability. We've talked about validity. Are we measuring what we think we are measuring? Reliability is different.
Reliability is about consistency. If you use a tool to measure something today and use the exact same tool to measure the exact same thing tomorrow, do you get the exact same result?
Think of a scale in your bathroom.
Exactly. If you step on it and it says 150 pounds and you step off and step back on 30 seconds later and it says 165 pounds.
The scale is broken. It's totally unreliable.
Now apply that to clinical instruments. If a study is measuring patient pain in an ICU using a nonverbal pain scale, like the CPOT,
Okay.
if nurse A looks at the patient, uses the scale, and scores a 3, and 5 minutes later, nurse B looks at the same patient, uses the same scale, and scores an 8, that instrument has terrible inter-rater reliability.
It's essentially producing random numbers.
Yes. If a study is built on data gathered from an unreliable tool, the entire foundation of the research is made of sand.
Okay, we have survived the threshold. The design was right, and the execution was solid. They guarded against bias, they controlled for confounders, their tools were reliable.
Now we move to questions 3 and 4 of the appraisal process. How do we actually score this thing?
We have to assign it a level and a quality. But the system is so counterintuitive, it almost feels like a trick.
It is the most common stumbling block for professionals learning to appraise. They conflate the two concepts. Level and quality measure entirely different dimensions of the study.
Let's lay out the levels first. The framework uses the Johns Hopkins evidence-based practice model, which gives us levels I through V.
Level I sits at the top. This is reserved for experimental designs that can prove causation. High-quality randomized controlled trials and the systematic reviews or meta-analyses built upon those RCTs.
Level 2 drops down to our quasi-experimental studies, the ones with an intervention but no randomization.
Right. Level 3 captures the non-experimental designs, the observational cohort studies, the descriptive surveys, and this is also exactly where qualitative research sits.
Level 4 is reserved for clinical practice guidelines and consensus statements from recognized expert bodies.
And Level V is the foundation of non-research evidence. Quality improvement data, program evaluations, case reports, and the clinical expertise of practitioners.
Okay, here is the trap I see everyone fall into. When you number something 1 through 5, the human brain automatically assigns a hierarchy of worth.
Oh, absolutely.
We think of the Olympics. Level 1 is the gold medal. Level 2 is the silver. Level 3 is bronze. Therefore, a level I study is inherently objectively better and more valuable than a level 3 study.
And that assumption will destroy your ability to practice evidence-based medicine. Let me destroy the Olympic medal metaphor entirely.
Please do.
The level of evidence only measures the study design's architectural strength for answering questions about cause and effect. It does not measure the quality of the execution, and it certainly does not measure the relevance of the study to your patient.
Wait, go deeper on that. How can a level I not be the best?
Yeah, let's go back to our diabetic diet example from earlier. Your patients are refusing the food. Your clinical question is, why are my patients non-compliant?
Right.
If someone hands you a level A randomized controlled trial, testing a new educational pamphlet about diabetes, it might be a flawlessly executed level I study, but it doesn't answer your question.
No, it doesn't.
However, if someone hands you a level 3 qualitative study involving deep interviews with diabetic patients from your specific cultural demographic explaining their dietary aversions,
Yeah.
that level 3 study is infinitely more valuable to you than the level 1.
Because it's the right tool for the job. The level just tells you what kind of tool it is.
Exactly. And furthermore, you can have a level I study that is an absolute disaster in terms of execution. A researcher might randomize patients, boom, it's level 1,
Yeah. Okay.
but they only included 12 people. They lost half of them to attrition, and their measurement tools were completely unreliable. It holds the title of level I, but scientifically, it is garbage.
Which perfectly explains why question 4 exists. What is the quality rating? This is where we actually grade the execution.
In this framework, you assign a rating of high, good, or low quality. High quality means the study is practically a unicorn. The sample size was massive, the randomization was flawless, blinding was maintained perfectly, and the authors controlled for every imaginable confounder.
Sounds like something you only see in billion-dollar pharma trials.
It is rare in real-world clinical nursing research. Good quality is much more common. A good quality study means the researchers did a solid, rigorous job, but there are some acknowledged limitations.
Like what?
Maybe they couldn't recruit quite as many patients as they wanted. Maybe perfect blinding was physically impossible because the intervention involved a specific nursing action that couldn't be hidden.
But the key is that the researchers are honest about those flaws.
Yes, they transparently report the limitations. And despite those flaws, the data is robust enough that you can still trust the general direction of the findings.
Okay, what about low quality?
Low quality means the fortress walls collapsed, the attrition was massive, the selection bias was glaring, or the statistical analysis was wildly inappropriate. A low-quality study is one where the flaws are so severe that you cannot safely use the results to make clinical decisions.
I think it is so comforting to hear that good quality is acceptable. We don't have to throw a paper in the trash just because it isn't flawless.
If you threw away every imperfect study, you would have an empty library. Human beings are messy. Clinical environments are chaotic. You are evaluating whether the evidence is strong enough to act upon, not whether it is perfect.
Okay, let's pivot to the final massive concept. We've done the work. We found a study. It is a level I, high-quality RCT. It has incredible internal validity.
We know with absolute certainty that the intervention worked for the people who were inside this study.
But here is the brutal reality. You, the professional listening right now, do not treat the people inside that study. You treat the people in the beds on your unit.
And this is where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah.
This is external validity, the so what question.
Internal validity means it worked in the lab. External validity asks, will it work on a Tuesday afternoon during a shift change in your hospital?
It is about applicability and generalizability. You have to take this pristine, laboratory-tested protocol and imagine superimposing it over the messy reality of your specific clinical environment.
Let's paint a really stark picture here. You find an amazing study. It proves that a highly complex, aggressive, early mobility protocol in the ICU reduces delirium rates by 40%. It is the holy grail.
Okay.
But then you read the methods section closely. This study was conducted in a 1,200-bed urban academic trauma center. They had massive funding. They had a dedicated 247 team of physical therapists and mobility technicians whose only job was to execute this protocol.
And then you look at your reality. You are the charge nurse in a 60-bed rural critical access hospital. Your patient population leans much older, with multiple complex comorbidities.
And I definitely don't have a 247 mobility team. I have one physical therapist who covers the whole hospital and goes home at 5:00 p.m.
Can you take that protocol and implement it tomorrow?
It would be incredibly dangerous to try.
Look at the disparities. Is the patient sample similar? No, your patients are significantly older and frailer. Is the setting comparable? Not even close. Are the resources available? Absolutely not.
The internal validity of that study is flawless. They proved it works in their environment.
But the external validity of that study for your practice is practically zero.
It's like finding a recipe for a delicate 5-star French pastry that requires a $20,000 professional steam oven. The recipe isn't wrong, it's a great recipe, but if you try to bake it in a college dorm room microwave, you are going to get a disaster.
That is a perfect analogy. And there is an even deeper, profoundly important layer to external validity that we have to discuss. We need to look at the evidence through a health equity lens.
This isn't about resources. This is about basic human biology and representation.
Right. You have to look at who was included in the trial, and more importantly, who was structurally excluded.
Let's look at pain management literature.
Okay.
Imagine you find a high-quality RCT testing a new pharmacological intervention for chronic pain. The internal validity is great, but when you look at the demographic breakdown table, which is often buried on page 4 of the article, by the way, you realize that 95% of the participants in the trial were middle-aged white males.
Which is an incredibly common occurrence in historical medical research.
Now, imagine you work in a highly diverse urban community clinic. Can you confidently take the dosage recommendations from that study and apply them to an elderly Black woman or a young Hispanic man?
Decades of rigorous physiological research consistently demonstrate that pain perception, drug metabolism, and therapeutic responses vary significantly across different demographics, genetic backgrounds, and even genders.
So if a study completely ignores massive segments of the human population, what do we do with it? Is applying it to our diverse patients just bad science?
It is fundamentally unscientific to extrapolate data onto a population that wasn't tested. It's guessing. And when we are dealing with human lives, guessing is dangerous.
Right.
Evaluating this isn't about lecturing the researchers about their recruitment strategies. It is about radical scientific honesty. It is about looking at that beautiful, high-quality evidence and having the courage to say, this intervention is proven safe and effective for white men. We have zero mathematical proof that it is safe for the Black women we treat in our clinic.
It's a massive failure of external validity.
Exactly. And recognizing that failure is the hallmark of an advanced evidence-based practitioner. You have to ethically flag those gaps.
Sometimes applying evidence-based practice doesn't mean blindly adopting a new protocol.
Sometimes it means standing up in a committee meeting and saying, we cannot adopt this standard yet because the literature does not represent the patients sitting in our waiting room.
That is a heavy but incredibly necessary realization. All right, we have spent a long time in the theoretical realm. We understand validities, biases, confounders, and levels.
Let's pivot to the mechanics.
How does the listener actually physically do this? What is the real-world workflow when they sit down at their desk tomorrow?
Step one is the most obvious, but the most frequently skipped. You have to read the full article, end to end.
Not just the abstract. We established that the abstract is just marketing.
If you really want to know the quality of a study quickly, you skip the abstract entirely and flip straight to the end of the discussion section. You look for the paragraph labeled Limitations.
Why is that the goldmine?
Because that is where the peer reviewers force the authors to confess their sins. Researchers don't voluntarily point out that their sample size was too small or that their blinding failed.
Right, they hide that stuff.
The reviewers make them write it down as a condition of publication. If you read the limitation section first, you know exactly what weaknesses to look for when you go back and read the methodology.
That is a pro tip right there. Okay, step 2. You do not appraise from memory or gut feeling. You use a validated appraisal tool.
The framework highlights 3 primary toolkits. The first are the JBI checklists.
The Joanna Briggs Institute.
Yes. They create incredibly specific, highly comprehensive checklists. They don't just have one generic tool. They have a specific checklist for RCTs, a different one for qualitative studies, another for systematic reviews. They guide you to ask the right questions for the specific tool you are holding.
Then you have the CSP checklist.
CSP tools cover the same ground, but they are often written in more accessible, plain language. Many professionals find them less intimidating when they're just starting to learn the appraisal process.
And if you are appraising one of those clinical practice guidelines, the expert panel documents, you use a completely different tool.
You use the Agree-To tool. It is the international gold standard for guidelines. It doesn't look at patient data. It looks at the panel itself.
Right, checking for conflicts of interest.
It forces you to evaluate stakeholder involvement, the rigor of how they searched for evidence, and most importantly, it forces you to formally document their editorial independence.
Okay, step 3 in the workflow is where I think people get really frustrated. The gold standard for appraisal is independent review.
Yes.
You and a colleague both take the exact same 15-page article. You both go into separate rooms, you fill out your CASP checklist, and then you come back together to reconcile your answers. I have to be honest. When you are drowning in clinical work, having 2 highly paid professionals read the exact same document feels incredibly redundant.
Yeah, I get that.
Why can't we just divide and conquer? I'll appraise 5 articles, you appraise 5, we share notes.
That is the instinct of an efficient worker. But evidence appraisal isn't about efficiency. It's about accuracy. Dividing and conquering is dangerous because human beings have massive intellectual blind spots.
What do you mean? Give me an example.
Imagine you are reading a study about a new cardiac medication. You are fascinated by the pharmacology. You get swept up in the incredible graphs showing a drop in blood pressure.
Okay, I'm host.
You reach the end, check off your boxes, and rate the study as high quality. But your partner, who is more skeptical by nature, reads the exact same article. They aren't distracted by the pharmacology.
What do they see?
They notice a single sentence on page 6 that mentions 35% of the patients stopped taking the medication because of severe headaches, and the researchers simply excluded those patients from the final math.
I missed the attrition bias completely because I was focused on the shiny outcome.
Exactly. Two sets of eyes catch what one misses. But the real magic isn't just error catching. It is the crucible of disagreement.
Right.
When you come back to the table and you say high quality and your partner says low quality, you cannot just agree to disagree. You have to reconcile.
So you have to fight it out.
You have to debate it using the text as evidence. You say, I think it's good because they used a randomized design. Your partner says yes, but look at page 6, paragraph 2. The blinding was broken.
Wow.
That argument, that forced defense of your position, is where true appraisal skills are forged. It forces you to understand the study on a microscopic level. It is not busy work. It is the entire point of the exercise.
That makes a lot of sense. Step 4 is the final product, documenting your findings on the evidence table. This is the spreadsheet where all the synthesized information lives, and the rule here is strict. No blank spaces.
An empty cell on an evidence table is a liability. If you leave the intervention column blank on a qualitative study, does that mean the study didn't have an intervention?
Does it mean the authors forgot to describe it?
Or does it mean you were tired and just skipped that paragraph?
So if it doesn't apply, you write not applicable, and you briefly state why.
You must be explicit, and you must be concrete. Never write vague opinions in an evidence table. If the prompt asks about the sample, do not write adequate sample size.
Because adequate is completely subjective.
It tells the person reading the table absolutely nothing. You have to extract the actual data. You write, N 412 patients, recruited across 4 urban clinics with an overall attrition rate of 8%.
You have to show your math.
Because in the next phase of this process, when you move to synthesis, you're going to be looking at 10 of these tables side by side. If your columns are full of vague words like good or adequate, you will be completely unable to compare the studies.
Rigorous documentation now saves you from total confusion later.
It really does.
So we've gone from the theoretical foundations of randomization and bias all the way down to the exact syntax of filling out a spreadsheet.
We covered a lot of ground.
Let's pull all the way back. So what does this all mean? Why does this deeply tedious, highly technical appraisal process actually matter to the listener? They aren't trying to become research scientists. They are trying to be excellent clinicians. Why spend hours dissecting p-values and attrition rates?
Because appraisal is the armor you wear into the arena of clinical practice. It is the single skill that separates a true evidence-based practitioner from someone who is just regurgitating things they read on the internet.
It's the difference between knowing a fact and knowing why it's a fact.
Exactly. When you are on a hospital committee or sitting in a budget meeting and an administrator says, we need to purchase this massive new piece of software because a published paper said it improves patient outcomes, you don't have to just nod and accept it.
You have the skills to pull that paper.
You can look at the methodology. You can see that the paper was a low-quality observational study funded entirely by the software company itself.
And then you can walk into that meeting and have a highly intelligent, formidable conversation. You can say, I read the study, the external validity is 0 for our patient population, and the reporting bias is severe. We should not spend $1 million based on this.
That is how you protect your patients, and that is how you earn undeniable credibility among physicians, administrators, and your peers.
You become the person who understands not just what the evidence claims, but exactly how much weight it can actually bear.
And you will find that you are almost always working with imperfect evidence. We do not have the luxury of waiting for the flawless unicorn trial to be published before we treat the patient in front of us. The goal is to take the messy, flawed, real-world evidence, accurately measure its limitations, and make the most scientifically honest decision possible.
That is incredibly empowering. All right, for those of you following along with the framework, a gentle reminder about your assignment this week.
Yes, the homework.
You need to dive into your own stack of articles. Sit down with your partner, do the independent appraisal using the JBI, CASP, or Agree To tools, battle it out over the discrepancies, and fill out those evidence tables completely. Show your math. It will prepare you perfectly for the synthesis process we tackle next.
But before you open that first PDF and start looking for selection bias, I want to leave you with a lingering thought, a broader perspective on what we've been discussing today.
Lay it on us.
We spend all this time, energy, and education training clinicians to spot massive methodological flaws. We train you to find missing confounders, broken blinding, and deceptive statistics. But remember, almost every single article you will appraise has already passed through the gauntlet of peer review.
Right. It carries the stamp of scientific approval.
It has already been evaluated and approved by journal editors and supposed experts in the field.
So, what does that mean?
Well, if the peer review process is supposed to be the ultimate, rigorous gatekeeper of scientific truth, what does it say about that multi-billion-dollar system that we, the frontline end users, still have to be intensely trained to protect ourselves from their published work?
Oh, wow.
When you sit down to appraise an article tonight, are you simply evaluating a scientific experiment? Or are you actually acting as an unpaid, necessary audit on the integrity of the scientific publishing industry itself?
Wow. That completely changes the dynamic. You aren't just a reader. You are the final line of defense.
The ultimate responsibility always falls to the person touching the patient.
So as you look back down at that stack of articles, don't let the complex statistics intimidate you. You have the flashlight now. You know how to test the walls of the fortress, get under the hood, find the biases, and figure out what the truth actually is. Your future patients are counting on you to know the difference between a shiny abstract and a solid foundation. Keep diving deep, everyone.